It was a fine late spring day, and the sun beat heavily down upon the gathering as they watched on expectantly. It was to be another excising of the plague that spread all too quickly across their towns if left unhindered, and they were all glad of the removal of such whenever it was discovered. A dishevelled figure appeared from behind the edge of the Eodain's tavern, bound at the wrists, roughly prodded forward by the base of a man-catcher, as a guard followed them dutifully, herding them toward the large, well-worn wooden butcher's block that sat in the centre of the chained-off half-circle. His eyes scanned the throng who had gathered, all present being known to them as fellow members of the town, and their hearts sank, as their glee and anticipation could clearly be seen. He would be their lesson for the taking, it seemed, and his shoulders dropped a little lower as he drew in a long breath, shaking all the while with fear of what was to come. 2 more guards moved forward and led them, and as his eyes settled upon the block in the centre, he began trying to pull back at the sight of it, but they relentlessly dragged him there, to the slowly rising throng of voices of the growing numbers gathering. "Leave him be!" pleaded one voice, another stating, "They're too young to know any better," while the overwhelming cry of "Off! Off! Off!" rang out strong, pushing the fear even harder into the young boy now standing at the block. "You know what your crime is!" A strong voice boomed, almost deafening in volume, to which the reply came from many in unison. "Thief! Thief!" The boy's legs began shaking as the fear set in fully, and the realization he was about to face judgment arrived, with the mass of hate-filled voices terrifying him. The voice belonged to a mountain of a man who stood 2 heads above the tallest present, and he walked into the area where the guards held the accused from fleeing, and smiled to the crowded square. "Again you will see the justice of Valanek to those who break the law! Murder, rape, theft! They all have their repercussions, and their penance to pay!" And with that they threw their hands to the skies, to the roar of the gathering as they bayed for the blood of the accused. He turned to the quivering wreck of a boy who was barely able to stand as their legs fought to keep him up, and placed his massive hand upon their shoulder, looking deep into their eyes. "You know what you did, son, correct?" he asked quietly, and the boy shook heavily but nodded as tears flooded his eyes and he began to sob, as his gaze drifted from his inescapable mountain of a man to a small girl watching from the back of the gathered crowd. "And you accept your punishment?" he asked, calmly, with a peace utterly at odds with the bravado he had roused the crowds with. The boy nodded as his gaze tried to find the girl again, but she had jumped down from where they had been, no doubt trying to reach him, and he slumped a little as he held up his bound hands to this giant. He nodded as he gently took the bound hands and deftly cut his bonds, much to the shock of not only him but the gathered people. This act stunned the boy as he realized he now had his hands. He still had them, and they were free. He looked to him and started to thank him as he stepped towards the block. "But Valanek is also a merciful God to those who are led astray, who are not truly our enemies but need our guidance." And he looked out across the crowded square as their faces and voices began to show resentment and disgust at the lack of justice being meted out. "And this young one will be pardoned for his crime." The boy cheered as he turned to his now saviour, but the guards still stood blocking his retreat. "But he did commit the offence of theft, from our own temple nonetheless. So only half the punishment will be given. Just the one will be taken to remind them in future times." And with that his hand shot forth and grasped the startled boy's right arm tightly. The crowd bayed for the act, and a few began crying at this judgment, and one small girl pushed herself to the front as the boy's hand was held upon the block, as they struggled against the insurmountable strength of the one who held him. A blade was drawn with his right hand and raised into the air, and as it glinted in the sunlight, the crowd fell silent in anticipation. But one did not. "Leave my brother be!" the small voice chimed out, breaking the silence and held breath of them all. "He did nothing!" she yelled, as she ran full tilt into the one holding the blade and her brother, only to be grabbed and held tightly by one of the guards. "Ah, one of your family to bear witness to your penance, and to remind you not to stray again," he said, as he let the blade fall, neatly severing their hand and lifting the now screaming boy's arm to the sky, spraying blood across all near. The little girl kicked and screamed, trying to get to her brother, but the guard wore armour, and all it served to do was graze and cut her as she struck chain and sharp-plated edges. The mountain motioned to let her free, and they did, and she ran straight to her brother's side, trying to pry his arm loose from his grasp. "Child, there is no need for this. His penance is paid. The matter is over." With that, he sheathed his blade and placed his hands across the bleeding wound. "As I said, merciful. We are carrying out the will of the law." And with that, the blood ceased and the wound closed as they healed the severed area. She sobbed as she held her older brother, and scolded at the one who had dealt this justice to them. "You are a coward, cutting children for your own amusement," she said, as though scolding them. They merely smiled softly and sighed. "It is the law, and one day you will understand this, little one. Now," he tossed her a silver coin, "run along and get him something to eat. He looks starved." One of the guards laughed at the end, and added, "Aye, he looks like he could use a hand," but met the glare of disapproval from the coin giver, and felt the back of the hand sprawling them in front of all. "There is no need for such things. Punishment was meted. There is no ill toward them, merely their actions, such as I bear you no such, but your words deserve the response you were given." The guard picked themselves up and saluted shakily before vanishing into the crowd. The severed hand was taken by one of the guards and placed upon the large tree in the courtyard outside the stables, along with other desiccating body parts and skeletal remnants. This was one of warnings of Valanek to keep the peace, announcing what lay for those who did not follow the laws. An eye for an eye, so to speak, so murder meant death, theft meant removal so they could thieve no more, and so on. It was seen by many as harsh and unnecessary, but it was a deterrent that was very successful, and even many of those who spoke out against it, even openly, could be found present at the gatherings for punishment, and for the most part joined in with the cause for justice. A certain young child did not agree, as she walked her brother back to the small home on the outskirts of the town. "I did deserve it for breaking the laws," he assured her, but she seethed with rage over it. It was too much, and for what? Coin that had been left upon a table unguarded and forgotten about. Priests, they were idiots in her eyes, as if the gods wanted or needed that gold. They arrived back, and they were met by their mother, who burst into tears at the sight of her son's missing hand. She listened to all he said, of all that he had done, and scolded him as she held him tightly. She watched on, still unable to figure out just why this was so. Apparently one day she would understand, but she understood just fine now. Valanek priests were bullies and psychotics, and needed to be punished. Yes, they needed their own brand of punishment for being bullies. Later that eve, her brother lay sleeping, but she lay wondering why things were how they were, and her mother brushed her hair as she explained to her about the priesthoods and the gods again, and how they meant to help, but sometimes they needed to keep them all in line. She did not grasp why they couldn't just let them have the coins, as they were of no use to them, and they weren't using them. Her mother explained what an offering was, and she slowly began to realize what the coins had meant, not to her or her brother, or even their family, but to the priests. It was a symbol of their faith, of their willingness to give something they needed to a higher power in order to show they were part of their flock. The coins were symbols of their allegiance, their pledge, and giving something that meant something to such sealed their commitment. Somehow she understood, although she couldn't quite grasp it. It made sense now. Like me giving my brother a piece of bread because I am part of his life, right? She blinked her wide dark eyes in realization as her mother smiled and nodded to her. Yes, like that. Only to something even larger than that, to a god. She settled down to sleep, satisfied she now understood a little more of the world. But Valanek was no longer to be trusted as far as she was concerned. No, their rules be damned. She would set things right somehow, someday.